Thank you for choosing to attend this seminar. I think this topic is very important as chronic pain produces in most people a grief and loss response, which results in the appearance of secondary losses that truly affect that individual's life. This seminar will be a brief introduction to that, as you have other speakers who are going to speak on the same topic. And I hope that you will find all of this worthy of your attention. I'd like to begin by thanking 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐄. Alex is a physiotherapist in the Calgary area. I've known and consulted with Alex over the last 15 to 20 years. This brilliant young woman has become my pain mentor. And her article, Pain is More Than a Tissue Issue, is worthy of a read, and I hope that you will take time to look it up and consult it. To begin, I'd like to read a component of a report that I received recently on a client. This client suggests that she is struggling with the loss of identity as a hard worker after her injury. Her injury has impacted how she sees herself. There are symptoms related to depression, such as thoughts of worthlessness, intense feelings of sadness, loss of interest in activities she once enjoyed. As well, she has experienced symptoms related to anxiety, such as worrying too much, trouble relaxing, being so restless that she was finding it hard to sit still, being easily annoyed and irritable, and feeling as if something awful might happen. She also commented that since her injury, her concentration has been affected, impacting her daily functioning. I think that's an excellent example of what chronic pain can do to our responses to our community. I'm going to begin by going over some definitions. The definitions are definitions related to grief and loss. Most of us will make assumptions that we know about grief and loss and what it has done to affect us. However, we're a death-avoidant culture. Many of us have not been taught about grief and loss by parents, or even our academic curricula are often void of conversations about grief and loss. And so this is just a really quick review of what we're talking about. Grief. Grief is a natural response to loss. It's nothing new or unusual. It's the emotional suffering that we feel when something or someone that we love is taken away from us. Notice that something in there gives us the impression that it's a physical entity, but it's also the loss of functionality, the loss of our assumptive world. Bereavement. Bereavement's root comes from the expression to be torn apart. And the reason I put this word in there is because that's exactly how most of us feel when in fact we are bereaved. Loss is the state or feeling of grief when deprived of something or someone who we value. It's the reaction to the loss, and the intensity of the emotion that we feel is largely determined by how strong our relationship was with the individual, or in the case of functionality, how much we enjoyed that functionality. And I think I have a couple of examples I think that will bring that more clearly to us. We have to remember that we're all survivors. We began experiencing grief and loss from the moment that we were born. Mourning. This is a critical one for us, I think, because it is often misused and misunderstood. because grief is what we feel on the inside. This is my internal processing of a loss. Mourning, however, is a social process. It's a process that allows me to tell the story of the importance of the loss and how it is impacting me. But in order to tell the story, I have to have social connection. It's our outward expression of grief. It is the expression of one's grief. It is a social process. Enduring. Enduring and the following word, suffering or emotional suffering, come from an article written by Dr. Jan Morris that I'll discuss in a little bit. It is really a worthwhile article on enduring and suffering. So enduring occurs as a response to a threat to integrity of self, and that can be psychological self as well as physical self. And it results in a shutting down of emotional responses. So what we do is we experience something tragic and we shut down our emotions to help us endure it. Enduring is the blocking of the emotional response. Emotions are suppressed, squelched, sealed off. It often erupts emotionally in expressing anger at some trivial or tangential concern. When we fail to endure, and I think that this is important to us, is we often become unconscious, or we become relaxed and normal, almost associative. We become scared or afraid, terrified, or out of control. People who are enduring or failing to endure move to emotional control when they are ready to accept their loss. And this may involve movement into suffering and back when psychological, the future becomes evident. And I think that that's key, when the future becomes evident. Emotional suffering. So we go from enduring to suffering. Emotional suffering is a very distressed state of emotional release. It tells the story of loss to whomever will listen repeatedly. There's that component of listening again. Listening to the loss and how it has affected the person. There has to be recognition of what is lost. Recognition that the future has changed forever. And there's the grief. The future has changed forever. When one has suffered enough and the recognition has been made of what has been lost, then we move towards hope. Hope. Eventually, hope seeps in. Realistic goals are set, and strategies to achieve goals are developed. Strategies to achieve goals are developed. Now, for most people, this is a very social process. It's a process that allows people to check back and forth with individuals who are important in their lives so that they can see if what they are doing is realistic. Having gone through that, here are some medical and mental implications of this response. Depression, anxiety, of course, suicidal thoughts or behaviors. And I can say that's very true. Knowing that in North America right now, suicidal rates are going up. Increased risk of physical illness, heart disease, cancer, or high blood pressure. Again, we're talking about some of the symptoms associated with grief and loss. Significant sleep disturbances. Of course, for those of us who are counseling individuals on a regular basis, we always check for sleep disturbances because it has an impact on psychological well-being. Long-term difficulty with daily living, relationships, or work activities. Well, one of the things that we know with grief and loss is that we tend to withdraw. If these symptoms aren't dealt with, they can move us towards post-traumatic stress disorder or alcohol or substance abuse. So why does this occur? Well, contrary to what a lot of people think, grief is a natural reaction. It's a process that protects man's survival. And this is a topic that I find fascinating, but I'm not going to go into it here. I'm rather going to refer you to a book that I find very important, and that is entitled Spousal Bereavement in Later Life. I have a list of the resources that I've used that is available online, and I'll give you the URL to get to it at the end of this presentation. But it's a natural process. A natural process. And without it, man wouldn't survive. And I think that that's the interesting component. So what are some of the common signs of grief? Well, we've seen some in the brief précis of the file report that I read to you. But here are some more in each of these 4 domains. Physically, digestive issues, fatigue, chest pains, sore muscles, emotional issues related to irritability, numbness, detachment, preoccupation with loss, social, withdrawal, being detached, and spiritual, hating God or loving God or moving closer to the church or farther away from the church. Now, I put this in because I think trauma is an important part of this grief and loss, because any loss produces a trauma reaction. We often think of trauma as having to be a huge event, a death through a motor vehicle crash or something like that. But trauma can occur in ways that perhaps we don't consider. Things like being admitted to hospital is very traumatic. I just went through a minor surgical procedure and was admitted to hospital. It was terribly traumatic for me and took me a couple of days just to go through and process what had happened. So these are the common signs of trauma. I'm not going to go through each of them, but I want you to be aware of them because they will all affect your response or the individual's response to grief and loss as well. The impact of the loss. We have to recognize that the loss has created a situation or circumstance that will alter the future, and that plans and expectation may be lost, pardon me, or significantly altered as the person copes with the pain. The impact is often exacerbated by the pain as the person imagines the impact of pain on life. Now, I've put 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐁𝐄 law in there. 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐂𝐂𝐂𝐂 law is an important part of what I believe. And so I'd just like to share 𝐒𝐂𝐂𝐂𝐂𝐂𝐂 law with you if you're not aware of it. It goes like this. In a contest between willpower and imagination, imagination always wins. And so if what we are imagining in our life is doom and gloom, then we'll tend to manifest it. Another author that I think many of my clients enjoy is Dr. Wayne Dyer and his positive manifestations. And I use that when they accept Dyer's work as a part of the therapeutic process to deal with a lot of the secondary losses that I see in my clients. So examples of secondary loss. We have an individual who has experienced some sort of event, injury, or illness that has produced chronic pain and has now gone into a grief and loss response because of the loss of that functionality, whatever that may be. And it may be psychological as well as physical. So here are some of the examples of secondary loss that often come into my office. Loss of vitality. They just can't do things without thinking or having to plan for accommodations and contingencies. I'll give you an example. An individual that I know experienced a major illness and has lost control of his bowels. Wherever he goes, he has to plan access to a bathroom. Loss of confidence, self-esteem, certainty, clarity, the will or willingness to participate, to initiate, to return or resume activities. Loss of enjoyment, shared enjoyment like dancing with your partner, playing games, etc. Loss of ability to travel, time spent with loved ones, going or seeking new places or adventures, or even just being in a vehicle for any amount of time, go for a drive and see new scenery. Loss of memory. Pain grinds away at cognition. And you heard that in the little excerpt I read from that file. Loss of sense of time, our place in time. How did the time pass so quickly? This month seemed to have gone by as though a snap of a finger. Loss of control over body and independence. We've almost touched on that. Loss of fluidity. We can't just do anything naturally anymore. Loss of physical intimacy. Loss of sense of immortality. Grief and loss often draws us into an internal conversation with our own mortality. Capacity to be present with others. Loss of unrealized dreams. So as I considered this, I thought, how do I put this together so that it makes sense? I came up with this little chart, and I'd just like to go over it with you quickly. This hasn't been researched except from my years of practice. I've included within it Jan Morris's enduring and suffering because I think that they're important components that we don't consider. Enduring, for instance, has 3 different types of enduring. Enduring to live. I'm going to get through this in order to live. Enduring to enjoy life. And third one is enduring to die. I am going to make sure that I put away what I need to put away before I allow my life to end. So let's go. Traumatic event produces some sort of pain. That event needn't be an accident. It could be an illness. It could be something psychological, I suppose. It produces a numbing, and we heard the beginnings of that when we looked at enduring as a definition. Enduring brings into it a part of a grief response, and we went through the common features of a grief response. That takes us to emotional suffering. And emotional suffering is where we begin the process of processing what has happened to us and where it's going to take us in our lives. We move from emotional suffering to within the tail end of emotional suffering, if you will, determining the acceptance or the significance of the loss. You know, now that I have a bad knee, how is that affecting me, and what is it going to do to me? And can I accept it? Well, I can rail against it. I can go and see if I can get help for it. But if all help fails, then what? Then I sit down and I make plans to allow me to function with this loss, with this chronic pain. And finally, that moves us into hope. Those of us who live in the Edmonton area have a huge resource, and that's the Hope Foundation of Alberta. And if you haven't been there, I would suggest that you take a look at the resources that they might be able to provide for you. So, I want to just quickly go over 3 cases and then take you through a brief experiential process. The first case, I had a client come to me. He had lost a thumb in an accident. This man was an outdoorsman, a hunter, and a guide. After he went through the loss and discovered that chronic pain was now going to be a part of what he had to live with, he also discovered that he could no longer hold and aim a gun, and went through a huge grief and loss reaction because he could not see himself earning an income as he had earned it before. He also did work in the oil patch, and the oil patch would no longer consider him as a viable employee. Another client I had was a young woman who had lost functionality in her right hand. She was a chef, and knife skills were very important to her. And she no longer had control of the knife and was having to give up that profession and find another one. The grief and loss response to her was huge. And finally, me. I've always wanted to sail, and many years ago I bought a sailboat and outfitted it so that I could sail it single-handedly. A fall injured my left knee, and it was not repairable at the time, and I could not see myself getting a knee replacement. I was too young. And although I tried and took instruction from other masters, I could not see myself safely managing the boat single-handedly, and so I gave up my dream of a retirement that allowed me to sail. Cases like that all produce grief and loss. And when I work with clients who are experienced that style of grief and loss, there are a number of things that I do. The first of all is, wherever possible, I employ a multidisciplinary team, because this type of grief and loss touches all phases of life. And so, for instance, for the individual who was the guide, I tried to involve people who had successfully become marksmen after having lost a digit. Paralympics groups were one of the groups that I contacted. So I make use of special interest referrals. And I rely on my multidisciplinary team to give me that kind of advice and support. But one of the first things that I do is I try and equip the client with some self-regulation tools, because grief and loss at this level is often very emotional, and self-regulation becomes important. I also make use of hypnosis and self-hypnosis, mindfulness and grounding techniques. And to that end, I want to take you through a very brief self-regulation process. This will take about 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to Sit comfortably in a chair, put both feet flat on the floor, hands in your laps, and let your eyes close. And I want you to just daydream for me. Daydream about your heart. Think about where it's located in your body. Let your mind go to that area and imagine breathing through that area. But rather than just breathe in and out, I'd like you to breathe in on the first bell and out on the second. In on the first bell and out on the second. Breathing in and out. And in and out. And just to continue to breathe at that pace, because in a moment I'm going to ask you to change your daydream. But I'd like you to be breathing at this pace before I do that. In and out. And so now, let your daydream shift. Daydream now about a positive emotion, perhaps about someone special in your life, or perhaps about a planned activity or event. And just keep breathing at this pace. Now check your body. Notice what's changed, and there will have been changes. And then, in your own time and in your own way, just reorient to the room. On that last slide. That was an example of heart rate variability training in a rudimentary form. It's something I use in my practice on a regular basis. If you'd like a copy of the bells, you'll find them at trauma_alberta.ca, and I encourage you to go and look for that and other available resources at that URL. Just before we close, I want to remind you of Janice Morris's saying, "We could not understand comforting until we first understood what it was being comforted." And I think that's very appropriate for our discussion of grief and loss after chronic pain. Thank you very much for your attention during this presentation. I hope that it has inspired some questions, and I look forward to answering them. Thank you again.